nearly 200 years ago, a Danish philosopher described a form of anxiety that feels uncannily modern. Not anxiety as simple fear, not fear of war, illness, or physical danger, but a quieter and more existential kind of anxiety. The anxiety that emerges when a person becomes aware that their life could unfold in countless different ways and that they are somehow responsible for choosing between them. Søren Kierkegaard understood something about human beings that has become even more true in modern life than it was in his own. Today, many people live surrounded by possibility. Endless careers, identities, information, opinions, and ways of living. We are constantly told to optimize ourselves, reinvent ourselves, maximize our potential, avoid mistakes, and somehow construct the perfect life through a sequence of correct decisions. And instead of making us feel free, this often leaves people exhausted, paralyzed, or emotionally fragmented. Kierkegaard would not have found this surprising, because freedom for him was never something simple or comfortable. Freedom is not merely exciting, it is also terrifying. It confronts us with the reality that our lives are not fully determined for us. We must participate in becoming ourselves. One of Kierkegaard's most famous phrases is that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom. Because many people today are not merely anxious about particular events, they are anxious about existence itself, about whether they are living correctly, about whether they are wasting their lives, about whether another version of themselves might have been happier somewhere else. What fascinates me about Kierkegaard is that he understood this before social media and before algorithms, before dating apps and before personal branding, just generally before modern digital life turned comparison into a permanent condition of existence. He somehow understood that human beings can become lost, not only through suffering, but through possibility itself. Modern culture often treats anxiety exclusively as something pathological, something defective, or something to eliminate as quickly as possible. But Kierkegaard saw anxiety differently. He believed anxiety was deeply connected to human freedom, consciousness, and the responsibility of becoming a self. Not all anxiety is meaningful, of course. There are forms of anxiety that are profoundly painful and clinical and debilitating. But Kierkegaard was interested in something more existential than psychological diagnosis. He was interested in what it feels like to stand before the openness of life itself. What does it mean to choose one path while other paths remain possible? What does it mean to commit to one person when countless imagined futures disappear the moment we choose? What does it mean to become an intellectual self rather than merely fantasizing about all the selves we could become? And perhaps most importantly, why do people so often feel trapped between endless possibility and paralysis? Many people today live in a state Kierkegaard would immediately recognize, a state of permanent hesitation, circling around existence intellectually, emotionally, digitally, watching life rather than inhabiting it. And to understand why Kierkegaard thought this happens, we first have to understand who he was, because his philosophy was never detached or abstract in the purely academic sense. It emerged from a deeply personal struggle with existence, faith, loneliness, melancholy, and the frightening responsibility of becoming a self. Søren Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen in 1813 into a deeply religious Lutheran family. His father was severe, introspective, intensely devout, and profoundly melancholic. Kierkegaard grew up in an atmosphere shaped by guilt, inwardness, spirituality, and a constant awareness of mortality. Several members of his family died young, and through his life he carried a powerful sense that suffering and seriousness were inseparable from human existence. And yet, despite this sombre reputation, Kierkegaard was also brilliant, ironic, witty, and deeply observant about human psychology. He understood performance, he understood self-deception, he understood social theatre. In many ways, this makes him feel astonishingly contemporary. Much of his work explores the gap between the public self and the inward self. And this becomes especially important in modern life, where people are encouraged to display themselves constantly, while often remaining internally fragmented and uncertain. Kierkegaard believed that one of the great dangers of modern society was what he called the crowd. Now, the crowd for him was not simply a literal group of people. It was a psychological condition in which individuality dissolves into conformity, distraction, imitation, and public opinion. He believed modern society made it increasingly difficult for individuals to exist authentically because people became absorbed into collective performance. Reading him today can feel strangely prophetic. We now live in a world where millions of people perform versions of themselves online constantly, often becoming more connected to external validation than to their own inwardness. Kierkegaard believed that becoming a true self required solitude, honesty, inwardness, and difficult confrontation with oneself. Not merely absorbing the values of the surrounding culture, but asking, who am I really becoming? His question was not what appears successful, what looks impressive, what gains approval, but the question was, what does it mean for me specifically to exist truthfully? Perhaps the most painful example of this struggle in Kierkegaard's own life was his broken engagement to Regina Olsen. Kierkegaard loved Regina deeply, but he eventually broke off the engagement, believing that his own melancholy, religious vocation and existential intensity made ordinary married life impossible for him. This decision haunted him for the rest of his life. And philosophically, it mattered because Kierkegaard understood something devastating about human existence. Every serious choice involves loss. To choose one future is to abandon countless others. Many people spend their lives trying to avoid this reality. They remain suspended between possibilities because commitment feels like the death of alternative selves. But Kierkegaard believed that refusing to choose eventually becomes its own form of despair, because a self cannot become real through endless postponement. Eventually, existence demands participation. And this is where his understanding of anxiety becomes so important. For Kierkegaard, anxiety is not merely an obstacle standing in the way of life. Anxiety emerges precisely because human beings are free enough to become something. So what exactly did Kierkegaard mean when he said that anxiety is the dizziness of freedom? Because this is one of those philosophical ideas that initially sounds poetic and obscure, but once you begin to understand it, you start seeing it everywhere. Kierkegaard makes a very important distinction between fear and anxiety. Fear has an object. You fear a specific thing, an illness, a war, a financial problem, an accident. Fear points outward towards something identifiable. But anxiety for Kierkegaard is stranger than that. Anxiety often appears where there is no clear object at all. It emerges from possibility itself. Imagine standing near the edge of a cliff. You experience fear because you could fall. But Kierkegaard says something else happens too. you also become aware that you could throw yourself forward, that you are capable of acting. And that second feeling, that strange vertigo produced by awareness of your own freedom, is anxiety. Not fear of something external, but confrontation with the openness of possibility. This helps explain why modern anxiety so often feels vague, difficult to locate, and impossible to resolve through practical reassurance alone. Because many people are not simply afraid of isolated events, they are overwhelmed by the awareness that their lives could become radically different depending on the choices they make. Should I move? Should I stay? Should I marry this person? Should I leave? Should I change my life completely? Am I wasting my potential? Am I becoming the wrong version of myself? These are not merely practical questions, they are existential questions. And what makes them exhausting is that there is rarely complete certainty available beforehand. People often desperately want guarantees before making decisions. We want certainty before commitment, proof before vulnerability, emotional security before risk. But Kierkegaard believed this desire for total certainty is fundamentally incompatible with existence itself. Because to exist as a human being is to stand continually before possibility, and possibility is both beautiful and terrifying. This is why anxiety and freedom are connected for Kierkegaard. A creature with no freedom would not experience existential anxiety in this way. A stone does not feel anxiety. An animal may feel fear, but it does not endlessly reflect on all the selves it could become. Human beings do. Modern life multiplies possible lives almost beyond psychological comprehension. And because of this, many people no longer experience freedom as liberation. They experience it as pressure. The pressure to optimize every decision. The pressure to avoid mistakes. The pressure to construct the perfect life. Ironically, this often produces paralysis rather than action. Because when every possibility remains open, commitment begins to feel frightening. To choose one path means eliminating others. To choose one relationship means abandoning alternative imagined futures. Possibility itself can become addictive. As long as something remains unrealized, it remains perfect in imagination. The unlived life can still appear flawless. But reality always involves limitation. Actual existence narrows possibility into concrete form. Kierkegaard understood that many people become trapped in anticipation rather than entering life fully. They remain adjacent to existence rather than fully entering it, always waiting for clarity before committing themselves to something real. But clarity often comes through commitment, not before it. And this is one of the most uncomfortable aspects of Kierkegaard's philosophy. He forces us to confront the possibility that anxiety is not necessarily evidence that something has gone wrong. Sometimes anxiety is simply what freedom feels like. That does not mean all anxiety is healthy or desirable. Kierkegaard was not romanticizing suffering in any simplistic sense, but he did believe anxiety reveals something important about human existence. It reveals that we are unfinished beings, that we are not entirely fixed, that we participate in becoming ourselves. This is why anxiety often becomes especially intense during periods of transition. Say, leaving university, beginning adulthood, falling in love, choosing a vacation, moving countries, entering marriage, having children, changing careers, losing faith, finding faith. These moments produce anxiety because they confront us with irreversible becoming. A self is taking shape through our choices. Modern culture simultaneously amplifies this anxiety while pretending it can be eliminated through productivity, optimization, or consumption. We are constantly encouraged to treat uncertainty as a technical problem that can eventually be solved if we gather enough information and make sufficiently rational decisions. But Kierkegaard would say that existence does not work like that. At some point, life exceeds calculation. There's no perfectly risk-free existence, no completely certain vocation, no final immunity from regret. And because people often struggle profoundly with uncertainty, many retreat into distraction instead. This is where Kierkegaard starts to feel almost frighteningly contemporary. Distraction today is no longer occasional, it has become environmental. Many people live in a state of continuous partial attention, scrolling, refreshing, comparing fragments of other people's lives while remaining increasingly disconnected from their own inwardness. Part of the reason this becomes addictive is because distraction temporarily protects us from existential confrontation. Silence becomes difficult because silence allows deeper questions to emerge. Who am I becoming? What do I actually believe? What kind of life am I constructing? What am I avoiding through constant stimulation? These are frightening questions, and Kierkegaard believed becoming a self requires the courage to encounter them honestly. Because the alternative is a kind of spiritual diffusion in which a person becomes scattered across endless possibilities without ever fully inhabiting their own existence. And perhaps that is one of the deepest forms of modern suffering, not simply pain, but fragmentation. The feeling of being pulled in too many directions simultaneously. And beneath all of it, the persistent sense that one's actual life has not fully begun.